I'd like to welcome you to this event, which is both the beginning of a process and, in a sense, the end of a process, because it's one that's been underway for a long time. Of course, I'm referring to the dioramas and what the disposition of them should be and is going to be. For a long time, as a Native person myself, I have certainly found them problematic, but I also have understood why there are other people who have not been exposed to the same perhaps life experiences that many of us have and are not aware of what some of the issues are about them, have wondered why it is that we would be taking a step that will ultimately result eventually in their being removed from display. So again, it's been a long, complicated path to get here, including as recently as about 9 or 10 years ago, seeing if perhaps the presentation, which was known to be problematic then, which many Native people were explaining why they were finding it problematic, there was an attempt at that point in time to update them, to make them at least more factually accurate, and there was a lot of accuracy that was introduced at that time. But in a sense, that was sort of a clarifying moment, because it became, I think that people became aware that it was not just the issue of making sure that the statements that you saw there were actually accurate, but in fact that the representation was one that was respectful to Native people and required actually Native people to agree that it was a respectful representation. It turned out for many reasons that was just not possible. So eventually the decision was made that ultimately they would have to be removed from display. But also, we are an educational institution, and we're not about to smuggle those things out and shove them in some dark corner of a basement in the middle of the night, because we have an obligation. We understand this. We have an obligation to try our very best to help people understand why this step is being taken, why it actually is felt to be necessary, and why ultimately we feel that the education that people can obtain about Native peoples in alternate ways is going to actually be a better way to do this. So we have an excellent panel tonight that is going to be explaining some of this to you. The process will be ongoing, but I would certainly like to welcome all of you here. Thank you very much for your interest, and I look forward to a great evening.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much, Bob. I'm going to be speaking for a few minutes, I hope as briefly as I can, to give you a sense of how did we get here tonight? What are the issues? And for those of you who aren't familiar with the history, to give you some context. And by the way, I would say that the dioramas are probably the second most popular exhibits in our museum after the dinosaurs. So those of you who are interested in museums would recognize that that's really something for a museum to choose to take out their second most popular exhibit. So why? So for those of you who haven't seen the dioramas, they're on the 4th floor. There are 14 of them. 8 of them represent scenes across North America of different cultures, and 8 of them represent scenes from Michigan. Of the Michigan set, 4 are from about the time that Europeans arrived in Michigan, and 2 are from much farther in the past. They were made by Dr. Robert S. Butch, who was a zoologist and an exhibit preparator on our staff, and he served as director of the museum for several years in the 1970s and 80s. And I'm so happy that his daughter is here with us in the audience tonight. Dr. Butch passed away in 2005. In the 50s and 60s, Professor Volney Jones, who was an anthropologist, taught a class called North American Indians. And as part of the teaching, artifacts were brought out of the collection so students could study them. And at some point, it was decided to put them on display so that students could have greater access to them and look at them at their convenience. And some of you have probably seen those displays. They were on the 4th floor for many, many years. And Dr. Butch had the idea of developing dioramas that would show those artifacts in context. How were they used by the people who made them? And the dioramas are 3D scenes, and you'll have a chance to see them later. Dr. Butch's sources were publications written by archaeologists and anthropologists, conversations with anthropologists and archaeologists, and to our knowledge, according to an interview with him in about 2004 or 5, he didn't consult with any Native communities when he made the dioramas. The dioramas are accurate. I had a scholar here look at them, and he spent a long time looking, and after consideration, he said, of the scenes I know the most about, the one thing that I would say that isn't quite accurate is that there aren't enough guns. So that's stuck in my mind. I got involved in this process when I became interim director of the museum in 2000, and then later became the regular director. And I started in June, and in July I went to a Smithsonian workshop about museums working with Native communities. So this has been a part of my history with this museum as director from the beginning, and it's almost 10 years now. I learned at that workshop that the best practice for museums is to collaborate with communities in giving people a voice in how they are, and their culture is displayed. And this is a global trend. We've learned that around the world, museums are working with communities to give people a voice in determining how their culture is displayed. And it's an ongoing process. It's by no means a complete done deal at this point. And you'll be able to learn more about that in a global sense by attending a series of lectures and workshops this year called Translating Knowledge, Global Perspectives on Museum and Community. Not all of those programs are about indigenous cultures, but I think you'll find the whole series very interesting. So after I came back from the workshop, we formed a Native American Advisory Committee, which included Native faculty, staff, students, community members, and also people who were not Native, who were interested in the work, including anthropologist and archaeologist Lisa Young, who's here on our panel. And we talked a lot, and we learned a lot. And some of the things that we came to understand were that the dioramas and the artifact exhibits present Native people only in the past. And so we worked very hard in all that we did to try to communicate the idea of living traditions, that Native people are still alive today, that the culture has evolved over time, and that it's a really important message that we want our visitors to take away. We took many steps to try to communicate that. As Bob mentioned, we had an extensive relabeling project, and many people here in the room were involved in that. You know who you are. I can't thank you all individually, but we're very grateful to you. And Lisa was the faculty advisor on that process. We tried to communicate that Native people are still living today, and you can see pictures that say "and today," and we were able to get photographs of descendants of those tribes and doing modern day things like driving snowmobiles, for example, instead of having dog sleds. One of the interesting things we did was we gave a first-person voice in the labels in some cases, where an individual would speak for himself in this case, rather than a curatorial voice of an expert and a disembodied expert in the museum. We tried to fill in gaps in history, for example, talking about the land grant that made the University of Michigan possible in 1817. A land grant from tribes of Michigan, if you're not familiar with that story. And we tried to show a continuum of history by illustrating where tribes lived before Europeans arrived, where treaties were, and the 2000 census. We developed new educational programs with input from the community, K-12 programs and public programs that had Native people as presenters. We also developed a new planetarium show with a Native person as the artistic director and narrator. So I want to thank everyone who was involved at that time. Frank Edagawijik on our panel was one of the people who contributed, and Lisa, as I mentioned, and there were many, many others. I learned so much through that process, and I know others did as well. I learned things that I didn't learn in school. And I really want to encourage all of you, even as we're taking out our exhibits, to learn more on your own. You'll be amazed at what you didn't learn in school. Things about treaties not being upheld, the fact that tribes are sovereign nations within the United States, that Native people weren't permitted legally to practice their spiritual beliefs until the 1970s. Those were the kind of things that I found very powerful. Even after we did this work, the criticism of the dioramas continued, and you can see a really powerful example of that in the space upstairs. It's John Lau's faux diorama that he made to illustrate his view of what the problems are with the dioramas. There was a protest staged by students from the School of Art and Design that made the front page of the Ann Arbor News and other publications. We continued to have a lot of conversations with faculty and students, and many classes came to visit and critique the dioramas. So I can't really pinpoint exactly when I decided this is it. Our efforts have not succeeded. We need to remove the dioramas, but it was part of a process, and it was around that time. So what are the core issues that we tried to fix and couldn't fix? Dioramas freeze cultures in time. They don't tell you what happened before or after or since. Our new labels weren't able to counterbalance the power of those images. It's inevitable that dioramas stereotype people because they represent an entire culture with just a handful of people in one scene. The miniature size troubled many people. I heard stories about Native children who came with school groups who were hurt by the remarks that their classmates made. And for me, one of the key issues is the context in a natural history museum. In years past, decades past, it was okay to portray certain cultures in a natural history museum and not others. But I think in the 21st century, we think differently, and it's time to make changes in museums. We were concerned that children were leaving the museum thinking that Native Americans were extinct, just like the dinosaurs that they saw 2 floors below. And notably, the Native Americans are one of the only cultures represented in our museum and have by far the greatest amount of space devoted to them, or it was the case. And as I mentioned before, Dr. Butch, to my knowledge, did not consult Native people in developing the dioramas. Also, during this period, Native studies and museum studies have expanded at the University of Michigan. So we at the museum have been in touch with new scholarship, new ideas, and we're realizing that museums are changing around the globe, and we're part of a trend. We're part of a changing history of museums, and I think things will continue to change after this. So we consulted with our community, and our community said that these dioramas need to go. We spoke with Native faculty in the Native Studies program, and they made the recommendation as a group that the dioramas should be removed. The decision was made with the support of our dean, Terry McDonald, and Associate Dean Bob Meganson, who you heard from earlier. And I especially want to thank Taya Miles, who's the director of Native Studies, who is a wonderful counsel for me. Once the decision was made, we didn't remove the dioramas right away. It's been a while, and that's because I wanted to make sure that people had a chance to learn why and what the context for all of this was. I knew that in the near future, namely now, we would be having a museums theme year, or at the time it was a museums theme semester, which has grown to be a year. And I thought it would be a wonderful educational context for people to learn a lot more about these issues. And I encourage you to pick up a flyer down in the rotunda, visit the website, find out more about what's going on this year, and come back and learn more. There's also a flyer up in the gallery that you can take with specific educational activities related to tonight's topic. We did immediately discontinue our school programs and our public programs. And although we did develop a new kind of school program, which I think you'll find interesting, our former programs were placed Native people in the context of natural history. But the new program we developed with our new Ojibwe language instructors here at the university, and the 2 instructors are here this evening, introduced school kids to natural history from a Native perspective through language and stories, and that's flipping things around. We are providing some resources for teachers to follow after our exhibits are gone, but I want to acknowledge that there's a gap and that there really is more needed for teachers. There will be a program at the School of Education in November about teaching about Native Americans, and I hope teachers will be able to attend that. So this past summer, the artifacts went back into storage. They'd been on display for almost 50 years in some cases, and they really needed to be properly conserved in the modern way that we do with climate control and protection from light, etc. And in January, the dioramas will be moved to storage. They will not be thrown away, and faculty will be able to take their classes to see them. I don't know what the future will bring. Maybe someday one of them will come back in a different context, maybe about the history of museum displays or something like that. I don't know. We'll see. Stay tuned. So tonight we're marking the opening of a new exhibit about an exhibit. It's the overlay over the dioramas that explains the reasons why, or some of the reasons, maybe not all of them, why the dioramas are coming out. It communicates the range of opinions that people have about this, and we think that's very important. Not everyone agrees. That's okay. We're a university. We're used to people arguing about things and having different perspectives. We want to invite all of you to contribute your thoughts. You can write on a card upstairs or visit our website. And I want to encourage you to follow our advice and learn about Native peoples in other contexts. For example, you could visit a tribal museum or go to a powwow. There are other places as well. I want to single out Jennifer Beyer, who's in the audience, who was the designer of the exhibit overlay and instrumental in its conception. And I'd like to thank Kelly Cunningham for her counsel in developing the materials around this transition. And of course, I want to thank our museum staff who have worked extremely hard on all of this process. So to summarize, the decision was reached over a period of almost 10 years. It took many intermediate steps to get to where we are tonight. But in the end, we felt that the best decision for our museum was to remove the dioramas. And we're embracing who we are. We're a university museum. We're about education and new ideas. And just this past year, our staff created a set of guiding principles for our museum. And one of those principles is that we want to create a truly welcoming atmosphere for people of all backgrounds and all abilities. And I hope that through this step, we'll be achieving that principle. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Ray Silverman. I am the director of the Museum Studies program here at the University of Michigan. It's a pleasure to be here. It's an honor to be here this evening. Before we move to our discussion, I just wanted to commend Amy and her staff, the students and faculty of the Native American Studies program here, for engaging in what has been a very long, a very difficult, and in the end, I think a very, very important process. The manner in which this transition is being dealt with here at the museum is a model for other museums. This has been a very difficult process. It was a very difficult decision to move these dioramas, which have been so popular in the last 50 years here in this museum here in Ann Arbor, and to dedicate an entire semester of programming around this transition to engage the various constituencies of this museum, the students, faculty, and staff of the University of Michigan, but the larger community is extremely important. And again, I really commend Amy and her staff and all of the people who've been involved in this process. What I propose that we do this evening is to move to a roundtable discussion. In consultation with our panelists this evening, we've developed a set of framing questions to move through a set of issues that are embedded in what is going on here at the exhibit museum. Specifically relating to the dioramas. We'll first introduce our panelists and then have each of them speak for roughly 5 minutes, basically offering up sort of a stance on what has gone on, sort of situating themselves in this debate, and then move to about a half an hour's worth of discussion about these issues, leaving about 15 minutes at the end for engaging you in discussion. Let me first introduce our panelists. First in the middle is Lisa Young. She is an anthropological archaeologist in the Museum of Anthropology here at the University of Michigan and a lecturer in the Department of Anthropology. She received her PhD from the University of Arizona in 1996. Lisa integrates public outreach in her archaeological fieldwork, which she believes improves her research. For over 20 years, the Homolovi Ruin State Park in northeastern Arizona has been the focus of Lisa's field research and much of her interpretive experience. Her archaeological research examines how ancient communities were organized. She is also interested in how archaeologists and museum professionals engage contemporary communities. Her projects in Homolovi area involve collaborations with the members of the Hopi tribe, Arizona State Parks, local Winslow, Arizona residents, and undergraduate students from colleges and universities throughout the country. And as Amy Harris mentioned, Lisa was the faculty supervisor for the diorama relabeling project in 2001 through 2003, and an advisor for other aspects of the exhibit museum's efforts to revise and revitalize its Native American exhibits and programs. On the far right is our next panelist, John Lau. This academic year, he is visiting assistant professor in American Indian Studies at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He is an enrolled member of the Pokagon Band Potawatomi Indian Nation and grew up in southwestern Michigan. John earned his first BA at Michigan State University and a law degree from the University of Michigan. He then practiced law for a number of years, including working on the effort to restore federal recognition as a sovereign nation to the Pokagon Potawatomi. John also served as a tribal attorney for the Pokagon Potawatomi and as a tribal council member, and continues to serve on the Traditions and Repatriation Committee of the tribe. John earned his second BA in American Indian Studies from the University of Minnesota, an MA in Social Sciences from the University of Chicago, and is finishing his PhD in American Culture at the University of Michigan. While at the University of Michigan, he has also earned a graduate certificate in museum studies. Most recently, John served as executive director of the Mitchell Museum of the American Indian in Evanston, Illinois. Our third panelist, on the far left, is Frank Edebagishik. He lives in Harbor Springs, Michigan. An Odawa Indian from northern Lower Michigan, he grew up in Harbor Springs on Little Traverse Bay in the Odawa homeland. He opened Pipigua Pottery and Gallery in 1974 in Traverse City, Michigan. In 1989, Frank was elected on the board of the Little Traverse Bay Bands of Odawa Indians and became tribal chairman in 1991. Since then, he has served as tribal chair many times, and I just learned this evening that he just recently, a few weeks ago, stepped down as tribal chairman. As an artist, Frank has worked to revive the making of the traditional Indian pottery of the Great Lakes area. After years of research and experimentation with his pots are virtually indistinguishable from the pots once made in Michigan. Not only was his goal to make the pots that his ancestors had made, but also to revive traditional pottery making as a contemporary art form in Indian communities of Michigan. So he's not making reproductions of pots, but basically revitalizing this important tradition. His pottery is in public and private collections throughout the world. In addition to making pottery, Frank is a traditional storyteller. Each year since 1974, Frank has given numerous demonstrations, lectures, workshops, and in-service training programs on stoneware pottery, Indian culture, and storytelling. He has also worked as a consultant for several universities, museums, and private organizations, and serves as a board member and in other capacities for numerous local, state, and national organizations. As Amy Harris mentioned, Frank was involved in the exhibit museum's efforts in the early 2000s to improve the Native American exhibits here. So we have a very well-schooled, well-informed group of panelists this evening to address what I think are a set of important, compelling, poignant issues. So let's begin. One might think that American Indians would be honored by the dioramas that have been on display here for 50 years. Why instead have they been offended? So John, you want to take a stab at that?
You're not going to let us do our 5 minutes.
Yeah, you're not.
Oh, sorry. I completely.
Come on.
Thank you.
Spend at least 10 minutes doing that.
I beg my
Mea culpa.
Okay, so John, why don't you start with your 5 minutes?
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Although I think maybe it'd be most appropriate for Frank since
think so,
he's,
too.
he's the elder at the table.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Ani, nakoi gije kondishnikas. Pipigwao do dem waganaksing and donjaba. I'm one of the things that I've been taught as I've grown up and spoken with my elders from the tribe and from many other locations is to think long term and to that I've met people in my work from various places that think of a long-range plan, for instance, as being something that's 5 years or 10 years. And we're taught, on the other hand, to think of 7 generations, to think through the consequences of our actions through a time period that would encompass 7 generations. And so we're all the time thinking about that, thinking to the future, but we also realize that each one of us is someone's 7th generation. And so we have things that were left to us, and that's what we're dealing with. What are those people later going to be dealing with? What we do. And so we have a responsibility, but we also have tools. And so to me, that's one of the things that I think about. And I know that that as growing up in Michigan and being in many bus trips to museums all over the place that we used to go, and you get a pretty good perception of things. And I know how many buses. I've been here often and watched how many buses are here from different schools and different places, and you see all the kids come through. Well, being 60 years old this year, it was 50 years ago that I was on those bus trips often. And as we've talked about things in this museum, there's many things that are just about exactly alike today as they were 50 years ago. Things have changed, things are evolving, and they're moving, exhibits are freshened, but a lot of the concepts are the same. And to me, those kids that came through 50 years ago, and 30 years ago, and 20 years ago, and 10 years ago, they went on to become staff people for congressmen. They became congressmen. They may very well have become president. They're part of the governing structure of our state, of our country. They're the teachers in our schools, and they have all kinds of interesting perceptions. And what they saw when they came to this museum, over all those years, over all this time, what they've seen are Native Americans right next to dinosaurs, and between just the other side from the minerals. Well, the thing that happens with that, and why it's so important for us to think about this, to me, is that when, as tribal people, one of the things that as a tribal leader, that I had to deal with is whenever I went to deal with the U.S. Congress, and I went before the House committee on several occasions to deal with issues, and the committee that tribes go to is a subcommittee of the Natural Resources Committee. In the U.S. government, we have the same general position that we do in this museum. Even more important to that, when we're working on budgets, on issues of our health care, on issues of policing and all of these other issues, and we're dealing with issues of statesmanship, we're not dealing with the State Department. In our budgets, we work with the Department of Interior, right next to the national parks and all of the other things. And even more important yet, when our budget requests go in, to the Office of Management and Budget. The people in the Office of Management and Budget who are dealing with Native issues are those same kids who came through these museums 20 and 30 years ago. And actually doesn't seem odd to them at all that they should be dealing with Indian issues, the same person who's dealing with the natural resources. But what that does is it diminishes their ability to conceive of tribes as sovereign nations and to conceive of us as people who are alive and thriving and have a future, rather than people who are all dead and gone and can be studied. And that's it. And so to me, this is what's important. So when you look at the dioramas, the question isn't, are they well done? Are they accurate? Are they this? Are they that? Or all these other things? The question is the context within which you find them. And I think my 5 minutes are done, so we'll continue later.
Okay, I guess we'll go by age. Yes, Boujou, hello. Some thoughts that I jotted down. One is, and some of these have been mentioned and will be continued to be mentioned, and I would love to hear your thoughts about this also, we all would. One is the obvious problematic of representing Indian people in a natural history museum. As Frank's mentioned, as Ray, as Amy have all mentioned, that represents, or at least infers, Indian peoples as a resource, a natural resource to be managed as part of the landscape, as people without a history, different from other civilizations. And so that's a huge problematic, whether or not we're represented in dioramas or not. Being represented in a natural history museum has its own problems. The diorama specifically, I can only assume, and I suspect, of course, that they were made with the best of intentions and made as accurate as possible. Pedagogy changes, sensibilities change. These are 50 years old. I have a lot of nostalgia for the Dick and Jane books that I grew up on. When I was in first grade, I don't think they read those books anymore. Women aren't relegated to cooking and childcare, and people would think it was odd, if it's, well, those books were good enough for when I was a kid, so I demand my kids get to read them too. Teaching methods change all the time, and that's what this museum is about. It's an educational place, right? It's a place of communication, sharing, and hopefully we're using the best methods in education. When I first came back here, I never saw this museum when I was in law school. I didn't have time to leave the law quad. With one of the folks, two of the folks on my dissertation committee here in the audience, I shouldn't mention that, I did have time when I came back to visit the museum when I was in the PhD program. Not that, oh boy. Shut out the microphone. I came here, and I came up to the 4th floor, and I was expecting something different, to be honest. And I was really hurt when I saw those dioramas. I've seen dioramas at the Field Museum. I've seen dioramas all across the country. I've seen dioramas at Walnut Canyon and Flagstaff. And, I feel diminished when I see Indian people reduced to the size of Happy Meals, Happy Meal toys. I don't like, I feel ill or awkward when I see us frozen in the past, ossified, captive behind plexiglass glass. And I just did not see this as, particularly as a taxpayer-supported school with a lot of kids coming through here, that this was a good way to represent Native people. Particularly because it's always problematic when a mainstream institution tries to represent any particular group of people. it's just loaded anyway, and it wasn't working. It certainly didn't work for me. And it wasn't working for other people that I spoke with. And so it also reminded me this idea of studying through cultural studies, this simulation and simulacra, thinking of Baudrillard, and this idea that the make-believe, the simulated, becomes more real than the real and more important than the real. And so these dioramas take on a life of their own. And I was reminded, just yesterday I was at the Spurlock Museum at the campus of the University of Illinois, and they have a hobbyist teepee there. They have a collection from a hobbyist, gave his collection to the museum. That's essentially the native collections there, is from this hobbyist. And he made a teepee, full-size teepee. And I asked, why is there plexiglass around this? Why don't you let the kids go inside that teepee? And they said, because that's a conservation issue. We want to preserve this replica teepee. And it was like, oh, what? So it... that nostalgia, that holding on, that clutching to these dioramas reminds me of sort of like this simulation has become more important than the people that they're being represented by these dioramas. I'm really excited about this day and drove here with Cheryl for 6 hours to participate in this celebration. Still looking for the shoes to come towards me, but I see it as a celebration that I think that it's a process, and it's a healthy process, and it's something I'm excited to participate with. I wanted to also put on the table that I see that this issue about control, it reminds me of, well, of course, I'm in Illinois, so I'm in the land of Chief Illiniwek, right? And so I see these people with the Chief T-shirts all the time, and they hang on to this, and we talk to them about how we're not honored by Chief Illiniwek, and now it's sort of like, well, you better be honored because we don't care. And it sort of reminds me of the dioramas in a way. It's like, well, we're not honored by these dioramas, and it's sort of like, well, if I get a response of, well, I don't care, then I'm thinking, well, I mentioned that I'd put on the table, I think dioramas are sort of the academic equivalent of sports mascots, and that we don't need these simulations. Also, I think education is about interaction, experience. I don't see anything going on behind plexiglass that is interactive and experiential. And so if you really want to learn about Native people, there's a much better ways to do that. And lastly, I'll just put on the table this idea of my concern about erasure. Okay, it's great that these dioramas are coming out. It's great that the other artifacts have been put into storage for proper conservation, but are we just erasing Indian history then? What's in other people's history? Is that the result then? Every time Indigenous people complain about the way we're being represented, just put us back in the storage case? I hope not. I hope that there will be a continuing, ongoing discussion about how best to represent all of the peoples that are a part of the community of the University of Michigan. So I'm sorry I talked so long.
I'm actually amazed because when I've been in discussions with these two before, they usually tell stories. So unfortunately, I'm going to tell a story, and that is my process of coming to get to know the dioramas. And it's actually been almost 30 years. I started to learn about the dioramas when I was an undergraduate docent here at University of Michigan. And even in that context, I recognized that the dioramas themselves were very powerful images. As an anthropology student, I recognized the accuracy, if we want to talk about that, of those images. But I also was honored to take Native American history from Dr. Burkhoff at the time, so I was very aware of a lot of the issues that were going on. And the other thing that drove me nuts is the diorama labels used to look like this. Nobody ever read them. They were very small, and they had really crappy information on them. They talked about the Southwest, and they only talked about the region. They didn't talk about the diversity of Native peoples that live in that area. And the context drove me nuts too, because as I was doing tours with children, we would either go see the objects in the cases, and then I'd take them back to the dioramas, or we'd go to the dioramas and then look at the objects, and the kids weren't making the connections. So I realized at that time the labels were crappy, and the context was not good in interpretive sense. I wasn't thinking about issues of natural history museums. That was something I actually didn't start thinking about Indigenous people represented in natural history museums until I went to South Africa and saw the Bushman dioramas right as Nelson Mandela was being released and apartheid was ending. So fast forward multiple years, and I come back to Ann Arbor, and now I'm a mom. And in 4th grade, my daughter comes home and says, "We're learning about Native Americans, and they are so boring." And I asked her to bring home the textbook, and she was right. It was boring. It was really bad information. And this is about the same time, shortly after Amy had been to that workshop, and I knew there'd been discussions about the dioramas, and I marched myself into Amy's office and said, "I have an idea. These dioramas could be a better source of information about Native peoples," because I knew the school teachers in town were struggling with how to present Native peoples. But I also recognized that that wasn't the only thing that we should do. And I suggested that we also think about doing a powwow display. And then Amy said, well, let's think about programs that we can do to bring Native peoples in the museum. So I ended up being in charge of the labels. And our goals with the labels were to give better context for the dioramas. Those dioramas do look like they're frozen in time, in part because there was never any reference to time in the labels. And one of the things we did was situate them in time. We also situated specific tribes, because one of my goals was to celebrate Native diversity with the dioramas. Even if they were problematic, at least we could start providing information about diversities of Native peoples. And we really wanted to put that "and today" message in there, and we worked very hard to put those things in. One of my favorite days were when Frank was here once with his son as a potter, when we had kids dancing in the rotunda, when we had storytellers here, and the museum felt alive. I remember coming in and smelling the smudging that was going on and thinking, this is right. Unfortunately, those programs got really, really expensive and had to be discontinued. Frank and I were also on the strategic planning team for the exhibit museum shortly after that project was finished with the diorama labeling. And one of the things that kept coming up was, do Native peoples belong in a museum? And I was actually inspired by some of the interviews that Frank did with some elders that said, yeah, maybe Native peoples belong in a natural history museum, but we shouldn't be the only people. And I actually think, I as an anthropologist think this is something that we really need to think about. Where should displays of people be? I also am an anthropologist, so I view us all as part of this natural animal world that we live in. So I think there is a place for people in the Natural History Museum, but not focusing just on Native peoples. We need to celebrate the diversity of cultures around the world. How we end up doing that, I'm not sure. But I think the exhibit museum is starting to make interesting discussions, and we're also starting to focus on this being a museum, going back actually to the original reason it was created, was one of the missions to represent the research that's happening at the university. And I would like to see not only anthropologists and archaeologists research like myself, but I would like to see a diversity of people's research on Native peoples, on world cultures, represented somewhere in the university. I think Ray and I, and maybe Amy, even daydream about a museum of world culture that would be anthropology, it would be American culture, it would be the International Institute. I think that would be an amazingly dynamic model for a museum. Unfortunately, with these economic times, I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. The other thing that I would just like to say as an archaeologist, there are times when I would really like to be out of a natural history museum because I really get tired of asking about the latest dinosaur find. And I have to tell people that I don't do dinosaurs, I study ancient people. And so in some ways it makes sense to separate out cultural exhibits, and in other ways it makes sense to keep them together. So I think this is an issue we're going to discuss a little more, and thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Actually, your comments have anticipated a lot of the questions that we've put together. But what I'd like to do is move to these questions to maybe explore some of these issues in greater depth. To return to this issue of what is it, in fact, that is offensive about these dioramas. Frank has alluded to some issues. John has. Are there other issues that you'd want to raise in this regard?
Well, I think that besides the, being captured behind plexiglass, being miniaturized, the people tend to, as I remember them, and as I looked at them today, they sort of look generic. I don't see a lot of differentiation, a lot of personality. They look like sort of some sort of stereotype of what an Indian ought to look like, and I think that gives an impression, a powerful message to students, and it did to me that about what an Indian should look like and what an Indian should be doing. And I didn't look that way, and I didn't do those things, and that made me, I wasn't so bad because, I was in my 40s, so I wasn't too threatened by it. But if I had been 8 or 10 or 5, I think I would have been threatened by that. And so that was a major concern for me.
Okay, thank you.
I think I will tell a story. Okay. But I borrow from other people's material. There's a fellow named Charlie Hill who's a comic, and he's Oneida. And this story I find extremely, it's very demonstrative of some of the issues that we have and why we have a lot of trouble with museum exhibits often and with the dioramas, and the story goes like this. It's Charlie says, I got up in the morning and I'd heard this. They say that they call the Indian the vanishing American. He said, I got up this morning, I looked in the mirror, and he said, I felt pretty good. He said, but I got to wondering, when was the last time that you ever saw a pilgrim? The point, of course, being that we don't expect the descendants of pilgrims to walk around looking like pilgrims. But somehow or another, Native people are expected, if we're authentic somehow, we're expected to look a certain way. And, we're less authentic if we're wearing jeans instead of buckskins, and we're less authentic if we drive a Ford to the powwow than if we ride a horse, or we're less authentic somehow if we're eating pizza instead of eating, wild rice or whatever. But we evolve. We're a living culture, and I think that's one of the things that I find that we have a lot of trouble. So to me, the dioramas themselves, just all by themselves, there's issues, but it's this bigger context. It's a societal context, and it's also the context that we find in the museum that I find that people get this perception from looking at them in a way that they might very well wonder. And a young Native student, for instance, walking through with his classmates, might very well wonder, well, why don't I look more like an Indian?
Lisa?
I don't have much to say, except I like Frank's idea of looking at change over time as an archaeologist, and the dioramas weren't able to do that. We tried to do some information in the side bars. The other thing is we were able to put first-person voice in the powwow exhibit, but it didn't work out for the dioramas. So we still have that sort of curatorial, not quite authoritative voice, but that's in there too, and that's one of the things that I still see as potentially problematic is the voice in the diorama labels.
Okay. So let me play devil's advocate here a little bit. What if we were to add some additional dioramas of contemporary Indian life? Would that make things better? Let me add, I guess, the fact that we find dioramas in a lot of other contexts. In fact, I've seen many dioramas in tribal museums. Is it okay? Do they work in that context? Or, and this is picking up on something that John was saying, is there a fundamental problem with the medium of dioramas that they should not be used in any context whatsoever, anywhere?
I think my first answer is, how many dinosaurs have you seen in tribal museums? Okay. You know, I think that's one. And you know, maybe the diorama just all by itself is not necessarily the issue. The issue is the context within which we find them. And that dioramas may be good and they may be bad, depending on what's involved in them. I've seen dioramas with life-size. For instance, you talk about miniatures. Well, I've seen dioramas with life-size people in them, okay? And I've seen things with that. I mean, there's that by itself may not be the issue. The issue is the context within which we find them, and then whether or not these are good ones or not. That's the other issue.
Good.
I don't have anything else to add.
Well, again, I can, one is the idea of this miniaturization, whether you bring in contemporary scenes, is still sort of this panoptic, invasive view, that sort of this intrusion, and it sort of reflects, you know, museums and educational institutions as tools that have been used against Native people. You know, there's a very difficult history about these institutions, and to sort of just presume that, you know, the audience should be allowed to see these ceremonies taking place, to see these people engaged in their private and personal lives, I think is presumptuous. The other issue is about tribal museums. You know, I've seen dioramas at Zebawing in Mount Pleasant, up at Mille Lacs, at the Pequot Museum. Oftentimes, as Frank says, they're life-size. They are real human beings. They're contemporary, not always, but often contemporary. But the bottom line, too, is that there's a central component of, I think that Native people have a right to represent themselves in a way that they see fit for that community. I think it's a whole different dynamic when a state institution is trying to represent just one small constituency of its state.
Thank you. To go back to a point that Lisa was making about labels and label writing, and what can a label do, what can't a label do. All right, you went through this exercise almost 10 years ago. Frank was a consultant on the project, many other people were as well. But it doesn't seem to have been enough. What more could have been done? Could enough have ever been done to make those dioramas work?
Okay, I guess I'm the label lady, so I'll respond to that. The labels we always recognized were trying to get some better information out. As I said, recognized that the context of the dioramas were hard, but I think Frank and I realized when we were on the strategic planning team that an entire interpretive plan was needed for this museum, and that discussion about where do people belong in that museum. I think the dioramas need to rest for a while, and I would love to see them, not all of them, but maybe a few of them, people think creatively about ways to recontextualize them, whether they are in exhibits about changes in Native communities that are done by Native American Studies students, whether they are used as images to reflect my archaeological research or something like that, but they need to be recontextualized. They need to be put in a context where people can not just see those images, but also see other things around them to think about living people. The living people that may or may not be represented in dioramas. The other thing that I would like to see, I've mentioned this before, is not just Native peoples. I think Native peoples were the focus of the exhibits here, and that created problems, a lot of different problems, and would like to see a diversity of people. It would be great to see a diversity of people. If we could think about this museum, you can see all around you is a museum of dioramas. It's part of an American practice. It doesn't mean it's right or wrong. Like Frank said, there's good and there's bad dioramas. It's a very interesting medium for me to think about interpretively, and it would be interesting to see it explored with other cultures represented. I have been at exhibits where there have been dioramas of archaeologists, and I've been finding that an interesting, interesting thing. It was okay. You were at that museum with me. It felt a little creepy because they feel plastic, but it was an interesting interpretive sort of thing too that often engages people. So, anybody else about the labels?
Well, the one thing about the labels that I've noticed, I've spent a fair amount of time now studying museums, thinking about museums, visiting museums, and now managing a museum. And it's a thing that doesn't probably warm any museum professional's heart, but the dirty secret is people don't read labels. That's the bad news, right? We spend so much time writing those, incredibly profound 200-word labels, and that have so much information so tightly woven, and it's so profound, and of course the people walk right past it, and they look at what's there, and they interact with the exhibit. They don't interact much with the label unless you're just a chronic label reader, like a few of us in this room. But other than that, if you watch, you all probably know this, is that's one of the problems with mitigating things with labels, is that nobody reads the labels. Or not very many people. Not enough people read the labels. And certainly I don't think with these labels, although I think these labels were a great attempt, third graders are not reading these labels. So.
I think I take the point from the label and once again, I'd rather move to the point of that it's the context of where you find this exhibit, and it's within what the other things that you see. I want everybody to look behind us. What's behind us right now? We're talking about Native peoples, we're talking about Native exhibits, and we have big bones behind us here, okay? Well, that's good. These are nice things, but I think that it's that context that we have that is important, way more than what you could say in a label, no matter what we did. And so I think that Native people in context with world cultures and history is important.
Yep. Well, let's look a little bit more at this issue of context. Okay, we're talking specifically about a very specific context here in the exhibit museum, but looking more broadly at the institution of the Natural History Museum. There are natural history museums that are much larger than this one. You take the Field Museum of Natural History, the American Museum of Natural History, where in fact the histories, the cultures of many other peoples around the world are in fact represented. But what is a natural history museum? Whose histories and cultures specifically are presented in a natural history museum? What expectations do people have, do they bring to natural history museums concerning what they will experience there and what they will see and what they will learn?
Is that really the question, or is the question, how do we guide what their expectations will be? I think that, those of us who've been to many museums know what we've seen there. I can think of an example. You go to the National Museum of the American Indian, and the reviews on the National Museum of the American Indian from the Indian community, we loved it. We thought it was absolutely great. But the museum professionals, the people from the art museums, oh man, I heard all these terrible things about it. And the people from the history museums, they didn't really care for it too, and they were really perplexed by it. And what it was a museum of living cultures. It was something that was dynamic, and from the point of view that we wanted, and from the native people, we felt that this really worked for us. This was something that was very good. But there were all these perceptions about what is that museum going to be. And it's taken a while for people to realize that they can go and experience what's there, and that's what they should feel. They don't have to go and think it's going to be an art museum, or they don't have to think it's going to be this, So what I think that we have here is that I think we're managing what people's expectations will be or should be, or we have a way to help form that, not just build on what people to this point think they're going to find when they come to a natural history museum.
I think when people go to natural history museums to see cultures, they expect to see exotic cultures and other, however you want to define that. And I would love to see natural history museums sort of re-examine and think more integratively. So natural history museums are great at interpreting natural resources and life on Earth. And humans are part of that, and I would like to see that integrated in. And in this day and age of global warming, I think we should actually have some serious exhibits looking at the role of people and how they use their environment, how they change their environment, both past, present, and future. And I think those exhibits would include everybody around the world, because we live in a globalized economy. We're all on this small planet and share it together with an issue of sustainability. And I actually think Native communities could have a lot to contribute to that sort of message. And that would take away that expectation of exotic and build on themes that natural history museums already do very well, and make them a much more integrative experience for people. But it's going to have to change those expectations, because people expect to go in and see the Africa Hall and the Asia Hall and the Native American Hall, and this would be something really, really different, but I think very, very exciting.
The only other thing I wanted to add was, I was just thinking, it's not really a direct response to your great questions raised. As I wandered down the hall past where the American Indian exhibits used to be, I turned a corner here up on the 4th floor, and there's the cases with the burial urns from the Philippines. And it's like, oh, that's pretty odd. It's like, so we got our stuff out of here, but I guess there's not enough Filipino, students here. Okay.
That one was done with Filipino people talking about that, and it's okay to do those sorts of representations. So,
I have a classmate who's Filipino American who was extremely distressed by those representations. So I think that that's, once again, like with the American Indian community, you can find Indians that'll say that they're fine with dioramas. And so it's just a question of sensibilities. And so it's...
and it also begs the question, who is it that's representing a community? How is it that you engage a community? And the fact is there's no such thing as a community. You're talking about something that's very complex, that within a given community, within the Native American community, you're talking about many, many, many communities. Sure. Who speaks for that community?
Right. Who's that voice of authority?
Yeah. And this is what makes these sorts of processes very, very complicated and complex, fraught. Yeah. John, you alluded to something in your comments about erasure. Okay, if we pull Native American stories out of the exhibit museum, where are those stories going to be told? Especially at a place like the university.
Yeah, I don't know. Lisa had alluded to the practicalities of the finances of it. I think what we need to do is pass a hat and we all give $1, and we start a fund, that matching grant program, and that I'm not sure that there needs to be across the street, a museum of what is it called? Classical archaeology. It's sort of like, I'm not sure why we're dividing up different civilizations and different cultures. I do like the Spurlock at the University of Illinois in that it is, the premise is that it's a museum of peoples from around the world. And I think that idea of inclusiveness is important. Otherwise, again, I'm afraid that the message is that if you complain about the manner in which you're represented, the result may be you just end up in the closet.
Well, there's a sort of a parallel issue with this, and that is textbooks. We used to, for instance, in the books on Michigan and the history and social studies, we'd be in the first paragraph, and then we'd disappear. Well, things improved. We got the whole first chapter, and we would then disappear. Well, there's recently a book called Michigan, that's McGraw-Hill, and this book is a 3rd and 4th grade textbook. It's a couple of years ago was the first edition, and we didn't disappear till about the middle of the book, making progress. However, what we've done in there is that we worked with the publisher, and we had the consortium of tribal education directors working with the publisher, and they were extremely interested in working with us. And what we've done is there's a new edition coming out this year, pretty soon. And in that, we tried to make sure that when we were in the context of it, and I do endorse this book. My picture is in the book, by the way, so I have to give you that disclaimer. But
Is it in the middle of the book?
What?
In the middle or the beginning of the book?
Actually, I'm in the early part, but I'm there as an artist. I'm also there as a politician, and there are other people that are in there, contemporaries who are in this book, and they talk about in the context of Michigan's history and how we fit into that and how we fit into various parts. Well, what we did is we told them, look, you're talking about all this, and then you have a whole chapter on governments, but you don't mention that there are 12 federally recognized tribal governments in the state. You need to do that. We shouldn't disappear. We're part of the context of this entire story. And so therefore, the book was a really good work. I mean, you did great work in it. We talked with the folks that did it, but you needed to do a little more. Well, I think that their willingness to do that, and the fact that there's a new edition coming out with many of the corrections that and additions that we've suggested is, I think, an example of what the museum can do. And what it is then, and you've talked about how you're already doing that in terms of what are the substitute programming that's happening. You're taking the rest of the exhibits and incorporating language and incorporating how does our culture relate, for instance, with life 15,000 years ago in California, or how does our culture relate to these other, how do we relate to the other exhibits? I had an occasion to work on the Public Museum in Grand Rapids on the exhibit there. And one of the things that we did, and that I insisted right from the beginning if I was going to work there, that while we're doing this one exhibit, I said, this exhibit cannot just be by itself. We have to figure out in the programming, how does this fit into the Grand Rapids 1890s, for instance? Well, in the store, they're selling black ash baskets, and those baskets are on the top of the store. And what other products are there because Indians have been selling to them, or have been, are purchasing, or what other types of things? So then the habitats exhibit, we made sure that there was sweetgrass, and that there were other things that we would be using, and that those things could then tie. So what we did is try to figure out, how does the museum as a whole relate to the culture? And what things can we do that will help enhance that experience for people and show how we're integrated. We're not just off in this one little corner in this one thing, and when you're gone from there, you don't have to think about us at all. It's that we're part of everything. And that, I think, is part of that, you know, the textbook and the way that you expand the exhibits in that way. I think that's how we work on this.
The take-home message for me of working on the dioramas was that Native peoples wanted to represent themselves. And so I think in terms of the void that's being created is that I think Native people should get to tell their own story. The one thing that I struggle with is there's a lot of resources to tell the story of the peoples of Michigan. But what I'm really going to miss is the diversity that was represented in the dioramas. That you could walk up there for however problematic they were, but you could see a Hopi diorama, you could see a Paiute diorama, and I think that's going to be missing. And I, as an anthropologist who think about a variety of cultures and think comparatively, struggle with that issue of how to somehow represent many, many Native voices. And I don't know if the Natural History Museum is the place to do that, but that's something that I would like to see. And I'd really like to see those poor fourth grade teachers that are struggling to present Native peoples in a good way, to have a lot of resources, especially here in town. I mean, the Grand Rapids Public Museum is amazing. Cranbrook has a little exhibit that's also quite nice, but with field trip money and things like that getting harder and harder to get, we need to think about resources that don't require field trips for teachers to do a good job.
Thanks very much. Looking at the clock, I want to make sure that you folks have a chance to engage our speakers this evening. Let's just take a moment, though, right now to thank our panelists.
My name is Veronica Passfield. I'm a graduate student in the program in American Studies. I am Crane Clan, I'm Ojibwe, and I'm a tribal member of Bay Mills Indian community. I've been involved with the museum and the diorama project. Lisa and I worked collaboratively with Amy on the labeling project. And after working on this project, and John and I have worked on all the kinds of stuff, and Frank is my friend and my philosophical soulmate. So, not that it's about me, but I want to give you a sense of where I'm coming from. After working on this project for 5 years, I have a little story to share. My son, we moved here from Petoskey, Bedasagay, and we had lived on our reservation in Brimley. I attended the Anishinaabe Language Instructors Institute, and we lived for several summers within our community. I was very concerned about moving my child to Ann Arbor for third grade, which is a standard curriculum in his school to learn about local history. Indians show up in the first week, right? So my tribally enrolled child, who had just been through his naming ceremony, who has parents and family members who are phenotypically Indian, so he can look in those cases and see people who look like people that he loves. He understands that the Potawatomi are our cousins. He got through a whole unit. I was the room mom, I brought in rice, I brought in drums, I brought in medicine wheels. At the very end of his unit, he came out, they did a booklet, they asked the kids to do a booklet. At the top it said the Potawatomi. Underneath that, my son drew a picture. His response drawing to this unit and to the dioramas was to draw a picture of 2 tombstones with rest in peace on there, and 2 very deep graves to the bottom of the page with 2 skeletons at the bottom. So it's interesting to see the different responses between Lisa, your daughter, your beautiful daughter who I've met, and my son. And these are different messages. And I feel like after working on this for 5 years off and on, that I feel like the one thing that we politely don't talk about is a more institutional critique. And I wonder if you guys might be able to talk about kind of the legacy of the relationship of representation of Native people here at the University of Michigan. How difficult it was and how long it took us to get to that moment where Frank was here dedicating the plaque for the Treaty of Fort Meigs. Or how difficult and how long it took us to get Michigalma taken off of campus, and how difficult and how long it's taken us to have any awareness about the 1,390 Native American individuals who are removed from their graves, mostly in Michigan. And I wonder if you feel that those things are connected with the only thing that's really visible here, which is the dioramas, right? The remains are behind locked doors. You need a card to get in there. Lisa was nice enough to take me to show me the baskets. So I've been in the building. Michigama was up in the tower behind locked doors in a public university, right? The history of Treaty of Fort Meigs was invisible in the curriculum until very, very recently. So I wonder if any of you make connections about an institutional history that could perhaps inform the way that we think about the dioramas and what are possibilities moving forward.
Miigwech. For those of you not familiar with the language, I just thanked her for such a good question. I attended the university as a freshman. I came here from a class of 44 people in a small rural northern Michigan school. And while I didn't see myself this way, many people who talked to me said that I walked around here like this for about 5 months. Completely lost in such a place where there were more people in my dorm than there were in my whole town that I grew up in. And so I was really out of context in many ways. But in addition to that, I witnessed I was going across campus one evening, and all of a sudden all these the Michigama candidates all went running by, half naked, painted red, for the ceremonies. And I'm going, oh, this really was strange. And there were, a number of other things that occurred while I was here, and I really did feel way out of context and trying to understand all of this, what was going on. As years progressed and I went through and studied a lot of things, I saw the university grudgingly and slowly understanding things better and making some progress in thought, right up to the point that you talked about, where I was out speaking with the president of the university at the dedication of the plaque that's on the north side of the diag that honors the university's relationship with the Treaty of Fort Meigs, and the fact that that was the sort of the origin of the funding for the university, and that many of the buildings here were built with funds raised from the sale of land that came from a treaty that was from Native people for the education of our children. Now I have to tell you, the university did not educate me. I had to do that with other means, other ways. And we spent a whole lot of time, not just here at the university, but across the state, working on the issues that came from this. So in the same context, I mean, you're saying, are these related? I think they are. I think it's related that, as I talked about in my opening remarks about the Office of Management and Budget and the fact that we're natural resources, and that's the office through which we deal with when we're working in the U.S. Congress and in the federal government on our budgets. And we have to sort of break that mold. Well, we have that same kind of thinking here in the way we deal with, the way we've been dealing with the university, and we've been dealing with the museum. I think you really hit a good point here, is there's a sort of a parallel experience between how we've been looked at and we've been sort of studied and talked about but not engaged, and yet now there's been more and more engagement. There's more and more going on, and I think that we're at a point right now where we're better able now to bring about change than we have been in the past. However, there's still a lot of change that needs to be done. And I guess, I jotted a note down here just to remind myself that it seems to me that what we're really looking at here is that with the removal of the dioramas, that's one step in an evolution. But this process is a continuing process. We're on a new course. We're working on this. We have to develop a process that's going to allow us to make course corrections as we move. And we're going to always you know. We're always going to be continuing in the way we do things. Ultimately, sometimes, I'll tell you a quick story. We were working on some legislation, reaffirmation legislation for the tribe to reaffirm our tribal status. And I ran into a bureaucrat who told me, this is going to happen over my dead body. I said, okay, we'll wait. You don't look too healthy, but you know, you could be part of the solution, or you'll disappear into history, I said, because it's been 120 years, we can wait a few more years. Well, the thing is that attitudes and things change. Sometimes it waits until somebody dies before you have new blood, new people thinking, you have new thoughts. Sometimes people evolve in their own thinking. And it takes, how do you say this? Virtually all, our whole society is a whole lot of minorities that are all vocal in their own ways, trying to reach consensus. And so if we have vocal minorities that are working on changing things, that's really all it really takes. I mean, to get change, you need really dedicated people. You need people who are going to work at it. And it's going to take time. And I think that's what you demonstrated in your question and in the things you're talking about. We've reached, I would have never thought when I started here as a freshman that I'd be here today speaking about this issue and about in this context. But I have to tell you, here I am. And I see that same kind of evolution going on, and I feel good about it. Now, am I happy about the way things are right now? No. There's a lot of things need to be different. But am I happy about the progress we've made, about the fact that we are making progress? Yes.
I just want to pick up on what Frank was saying about changing and evolution and collaboration, and also let you know that even though things are slow at the University of Michigan, oftentimes anthropologists get painted as never changing. And I've been stereotyped a lot as the bad guy being the archaeologist, but the field of anthropology is changing a lot too. And I think part of what we did with the Diorama project, where we opened a dialogue, we tried to work collaboratively, and then the project that John worked at with me on in Arizona with Hopi also, we made some inroads into working on collaborative with multiple perspectives, multiple messages being put forward, not just the anthropologist being the voice of authority. And I think that's a very positive step. My perspective as an archaeologist is multiple perspectives of the past make it a richer past for all of us.
I also want to say miigwech for the question. And they're great questions. I graduated from law school here in 1981, and of a class of 300, I was the only American Indian student. I had my own Native American Law Student Association. And the word I got, and I came from Michigan State undergrad, which does a lot of outreach with tribes, comparatively. Ann Arbor wasn't considered a friendly place for Indian people, not where I come from anyway, back then. I came back, quite a few years later, and it was a little better. It's been fits and starts. I was sad to see the dedicated person that was the Native student advisor. Apparently that's gone by the wayside. There's a vibrant Native undergrad student association. I wasn't aware of that when I was here before. I don't think it was there before, but it is now, and that's exciting. There's a Native grad student caucus, which is exciting. And so it's a better place. There's a lot of issues that are still on the table here. The obvious one sort of is the repatriation issue, repatriation of the ancestors. But I also wanted to mention that I certainly I should not be up here, indicating that I'm any kind of voice for any Indian other than myself, right? I'm not I'm not representing my community. I'm not representing any constituency other than I was kind enough to be invited to be here. So I'm one lone voice, but also that I really didn't have anything to do with, and I cannot take credit for anything that's going on, anything that's being celebrated or grieved about today. A lot of people worked very hard. Certainly Frank and Lisa deserve to be up here. I'm sort of the interloper. I think mostly because I made that funny diorama, and so I got invited, right? And so so I'm honored to be up here, but I just want to make clear that there's a whole host of people, staff and faculty, and other students that participated in this conversation, native and non-native, that participated in this whole process to get to the point where we're at today.
Thank you. Yes, question? Oh, question. Okay.
Good evening. My name is Joe Gahn. I'm on faculty here in American Studies, which is where Native Studies is housed, and in psychology. And I have a question about context as well. Thanks to Veronica for bringing up the institutional context, which informs a lot of what we're talking about tonight. But my question goes deeper than that to context, which informs the ability to appropriately represent any kind of non-white peoples in museums, whether they're natural history museums or museums of civilization and culture. My family just returned from the Blackfeet Reservation. Interestingly enough, on the Blackfeet Reservation in Browning, which is the hub there is a Museum of the American Indian, which was developed by John Ewers, an anthropologist who worked among the Blackfeet for a number of years. As of late, it's been taken over by the Blackfeet Nation, and so it is currently run such that in the summer, tourists can come and pay an entry fee and take a look at the museum. And it's very similar in some respects to the stuff that you see in the classic natural history museums. In particular, the dioramas of some Blackfeet events look exactly like the Blackfeet diorama upstairs. You probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference casually unless you really study them. Now, the difference, of course, is that they are running it now. They derive income from it, although it's interesting to note that the only way a visitor would really interact with Blackfeet people would be around either paying the admittance fee or going to the gift shop to purchase some kind of items there. But it leads me to wonder basically about this notion of being able to figure out more appropriate ways to represent this. And my concern, building off, I suppose, of John's comments about simulacra, but also just the idea that any museum is pitched to a broad swath of people who comprise the citizenry or the public, however you want to think of it, who come to museums of culture and civilization to see some other, let's call them not the public or not the usual public. And because those not us group is different in some important way. And so I assume that the museum interest for any kind of public is premised on them being different, not us in some important ways. And it leads me to wonder to what degree, no matter how you choose to try and represent Native peoples, it still isn't playing into the premise of a kind of imperialist gaze in which we retain interest because this broad swath is different than the norm, different from us, different from what is regular. And I'm trying to figure out how any museum of culture and civilization gets around that in the representation of Native peoples. And I'd appreciate your reflections.
I'll just point to Zebawing as an example. I think Zebawing does an amazing job of presenting tribal history, and that's what people should go to that museum to learn about. And I think that museum is amazing because the tribe developed it, the tribe set the message, and it's the tribe's message. And I think anybody who goes there comes away with an appreciation of the Saginaw Chippewa history that's presented in Zebawing. And I think it's a model museum that way in terms of how the community developed it and the message that's in there.
Well, very, very, very good question, and I think it's a challenge for the museum profession, I guess. I don't know that it's responding directly, Joe, to your question, but I'm just thinking in terms of cultural studies. we look at intersections. I mean, we study the other all the time, but sort of in this comparative way, and looking at intersections as much as differences. And there's, I think it's a valid things to explore and to imagine and to investigate. But I did want to tell a story. When I came here, the second go-around 5 years ago, I was very familiar with black ash baskets. My grandmother had made black ash baskets. There had been a black ash basket co-op created in the 1970s, and a real revival of black ash basket making that I found really exciting and I was very proud of. And when I got here, in what was that, 2004 or so, the museum was doing, or not the museum, maybe the anthropology department, I'm not even sure exactly how that's divided up, but there was an inventory of the baskets being done. And that first fall semester, I was here for like 2 weeks, coming with like a master's degree, essentially in anthropology from the University of Chicago, where we first met. And I volunteered to help with the inventory of the black ash baskets. And I don't remember actually who I spoke with. Hopefully not Amy or Lisa. But I spoke with somebody, and there were a couple of, that appeared to be freshman students that were helping to inventory the baskets. And the query was, are you in the anthropology department? No, I'm in American culture. You're not qualified. Well, so it was like I was shut out. I was shut out immediately from, and what then went through my head, because I'm Irish and Indian, right? So I don't let anything go. Is I thought about this for a few years, and when I had an opportunity to enroll in the museum studies program, I thought, who touches the baskets? Okay, the collectors do, the dealers do, the anthropologist does, the maker does, but also the museum person does. So if I get credentialed in museum studies, I could touch the baskets. I'm not sure where that leads to, except that that's my story.
I'm not sure that I have anything to add to that. That wasn't good. But I think that what we've been advocating here is that if there are people involved in this natural history museum, it should be more than us. And if it's more than us, it's a multitude of other peoples. And by that very token, it is the other that we're looking at, and I'm not sure that that's bad. I think that we do need to understand the cultures with whom we interact, and we do interact. Today, we interact with cultures all over the world. We step outside the door here, and we're dealing with Chinese pollution. We have to work very hard at making sure that they work carefully within Chinese society to try to make sure that they're going to have a stronger environmental ethic in the way they function, or our Great Lakes are in peril. It's not just native Great Lakes that are in peril, it's everybody's Great Lakes, but each of us relate to the Great Lakes in our own way. I'm part of a project where we're going to do a PBS a series on the Great Lakes based on Jerry Dennis' book, The Living Great Lakes. And this is going to tell the story of the Great Lakes from a lot of different perspectives. But I think it's important that we all have that, and we all think about that. And so I'm very, I think that it's okay for us to be looking at other cultures and things. And I think that it's okay for them to be here. But I remember the teachings that you talked about, one of the elders who was telling us that it was that it was not bad to have Indian people in the museum as long as other people were here too.
Yeah, and if I could just add my 2 cents, I want to endorse wholeheartedly what you've just said. The fact is, there is nothing wrong with engaging the other. And the imperialist gaze, yes, it does still exist in many museum contexts, but there also, as Lisa was alluding to, there have been significant changes in the museum world. And just not regarding how we engage Native American peoples. This is something that's going on all over the world today. The idea of representing others by engaging the other. The fact that you have self-representation in the context of museums. This is one of the remarkable things going on at the National Museum of the American Indian, that was a grand experiment that succeeded to a large extent, not completely, but it basically offered up a new, very exciting paradigm for community curation. The fact that a community, in fact, is telling the story. And you see more and more museums around the nation, around the world, pursuing that particular process. So we have time for one more question, do you think? Or if you all would like to stay, we have a question up here.
Hello, my name is Aaron. I identify as white, and I had a couple, I guess, comments, and maybe they'll be responses. I've been part of a number of multicultural workshops and do some training with white people, anti-racism training that I co-facilitate. And in those contexts, when the question of what does it mean to be white comes up, sometimes I've heard people of color say, well, one of the things that being white means is never having to say you're sorry. And I commend Amy and those who have been responsible for not just sweeping the exhibit under the carpet, but making it a place to come together and discuss why it's problematic. I think it helps me as a white person understand the racism and the ties to other institutional pieces that people have brought up. And there was another point. I guess I give thanks for the evening and for the exhibit, and also thanks for the for the Native people that spoke up about the problematic aspects of the dioramas, and who continue to speak up about other aspects, problematic aspects in terms of the university's relationship with Native peoples. There was an Ann Arbor Observer article that was written that was, I think, generally informative and supportive of the decision. One of the things that was in the article is it said that it started off by saying how the exhibits were very popular with children, one of the most popular things, but because some Native American peoples found them offensive, we were getting rid of them. And it sort of, to me, framed it as, once again, those people are causing problems and taking something away from us white people. And just wanted to say that there's a number of us white people, and I am one of them, who are also offended by the exhibits and find that when we, as white people, take people's land, build a university on that, then depict them and put them behind plexiglass, that is offensive, and that that's not the world that I want to live in as a white person, and that these exhibits are, and that bringing out the offensive aspects of them and making a decision to remove them, but also to talk about it, helps restore my humanity, so I give thanks for that.
Thank you very much. Okay, one more question.
I just wanted to say, on behalf of the Native American Studies program, that we wanted to take just a couple of moments to express our sincere appreciation for Amy Harris. If it were not for her sensitivity, her grace, her understanding, we wouldn't be seeing change in this museum. And it was not easy for her. What's he doing? Stealing the show. It was not easy for her to go through this really long and very challenging process. It took a lot of strength, and Amy, we really appreciate it. I want to ask Veronica Passfield to come up and say a few words too for Native American Studies.
All right, my friend. So Ty kind of said it all, but I want to tell you that we know and we understand that in leading this fight with all the grace and sensitivity and thoughtfulness and heart that you have, that you're taking on a lot. You're taking on power, you're taking on representation, you're taking on race, you're taking on a lot of stuff. And just from our heart to yours, we just wanted to offer you this gift of a blanket, which Frank could talk about the significance of a blanket, and a little bit of sweetgrass, which is kind of the ultimate for me. And it's tied with a purple ribbon because my teachers taught me that purple is the color for healing. So.
The significance of a blanket is that we know in Native communities, those people who work, who nurture and care are very important. And when we wish to honor somebody, the highest honor we can give in many ways is to share that nurturing, and the best way we can do that is with a blanket as a symbol. And that's really what I find is so important. And so if you will put this. Yep. And what we're going to do is drape this. We're going to have the women drape this over your shoulders, and to show our care and concern for you. And that's what a blanket. That's the significance of the blanket. Oh.
I have always wanted a blanket like this. Thank you so much. I'm really, really very touched and moved. But I especially want to say that this is not about me. This is about museums changing. It's about people working together. It's about learning from each other, teaching each other. And that's been going on for almost 10 years now. So thank you all for being such great teachers. And I hope all of you will keep coming back to the museum because we're going to keep on learning here.
I have one other thing that we should mention is that this blanket, I recognize this pattern. This blanket is the storytellers. And it's the night sky and the storytellers, and it's a pretty special piece. So thanks.
Okay, I think this is a fitting end to our session this evening. Just to reiterate, I think the big takeaway message here has to do with this notion of process, evolution, change. All this is about education, it's about learning, and this is something that goes on, hopefully goes on forever. So all the work has not been done yet, all the conclusions have not occurred yet, but it is the process of getting to junctures like the one that we're dealing with this evening that is most important. It is all about process and change and learning. And what better place for this to occur than on a university campus in the Museum of in the Exhibit Museum of Natural History. Thank you all for coming. Thank you.